Aaron Bastani has been on GB News debating whether British MPs should debate a Gaza ceasefire. Let's take a look.
I think he's right. They're entitled to have a vote, but we know from the early day motion that was put forward by Richard Bergen that you wouldn't get more than 100 people voting for a ceasefire. And I think this, for me, underscores a deeper point, which is no political party in this country, no major political party, neither the Labour Party nor the Tories, will call for a ceasefire until Washington does. Because of Brexit, we've had a conversation in this country about taking back control, making Britain great again, all these things. The fundamental truth is on the big questions on foreign policy, the uni party, which is to say the establishment within both Labour and the Tories, have on foreign policy a great deal of consensus, which is nobody in this country determines our foreign policy. Instead, it's set by Washington. And it's not said, it's not mentioned. If Joe Biden did a press conference in an hour saying, I'm demanding a ceasefire, Keir Starmer would come out 90 minutes later saying, I demand a ceasefire. Rishi Sunak would be half an hour later. And I think that says something quite extraordinary and actually quite profoundly worrying about the state of our politics, that a country with, the fifth, sixth largest economy in the world, a storied military of our own, doesn't act independently of a country thousands of miles away.
I thought that was very well put, Aaron. I suppose I was interested, that there's a couple of arguments you can make as to sort of why we should back a ceasefire. One is a sort of humanitarian argument about Palestinians suffering. And the other is sort of the argument you made, was sort of geostrategic one, which is saying, why are we going along with the United States here? And I suppose a right-wing audience such as that, which tends to watch GB News, do you think they would be more persuaded by this idea that we should demonstrate our geostrategic independence from the United States? And so this idea of saying we should take back control and not be lackeys of the United States is potentially a more effective argument than this will save Palestinian lives.
I think it is a powerful argument for conservatives, but it's also true. And I think particularly when you look at what's happened to politics in this country really since 2016, there have been, for the first time in a very long time, big conversations around sovereignty, who governs and whose interests they govern in. And that's often about trade or immigration, and you could have thoughts about that one way or the other, but that's just what's happened over the last 7 years. But we rarely use that frame for foreign policy. And I think what I said there is obviously inarguable. When Keir Starmer becomes Labour leader, and they're saying this is a return, the whole media, this is a return to sensible, grown-up politics, what do you mean? I'll translate. It means that he will just do what Washington says. When the White House says, jump, the Labour leader says, how high? And that means that all the people in the London Big House pundits in zone 1 and 2, they can all say, oh, great, we don't have to think. By the way, this is why most of them love the European Union, right? Because on trade, on immigration, on a bunch of policy areas, we don't have to think. That's true for politicians and journalists. We don't have to do our job. It's really easy. Loads of other stuff is being done in Brussels and in Strasbourg, and on foreign policy, loads of stuff is being done in Washington. We don't have to think. We just do what they say. And of course, if you actually say, well, no, the people are sovereign in this country, on trade, on a bunch of other issues too, but also foreign policy, all of a sudden, actually, I think it's a very powerful and democratic argument, an important argument, a progressive argument. But you're right. I think actually a centre-right or a right-wing audience is very open to it.
Macron has sort of come out in favour of a ceasefire. You also could look back to, the Iraq War, for example, when both France and Germany did not go along with it, with the United States and Britain did. Do you think we are particularly subservient to the United States compared to sort of other comparable countries?
I don't know about subservient. I think across Eastern and Central Europe, for understandable reasons, I think they align themselves instinctively with Washington. I think American empire has been very good for Poland, clearly. It's been very good for the Baltics. I'd much rather American empire than Russian empire if I lived in Vilnius or Riga or Warsaw. It's a fact. It's been less generous to people in East Asia historically, right, or Southeast Asia. But I understand that. So there are people, interests, parties, nations just as aligned with Washington, if not more so, when compared to Britain. But you're right to say Germany, France, historically two big nations. France did dissent from the line in response to the war on terror. And it's interesting to see people like Dominique de Villepin, who at the time was the foreign secretary, the foreign minister for France under Chirac. Actually he says things even today which are at odds with the received wisdom of the Anglophone world. I think France is a little bit better on this because, again, like Britain, it's a former imperial power. It has this incredible military history. And the idea that the country of Napoleon Bonaparte, which made history for centuries, a world leader in so many ways, industry, culture, as well as politics. The idea that they should take all of their cues and all of their talking points from the Americans is outlandish, I think, to many sort of French Gaullists. There is that current on the French centre right. We don't really have it here. We don't really have it in this country. The idea that you criticize American foreign policy and that Britain shouldn't just do what they say historically has been the realm of the left. And it is important to say, not just the radical left, right? In the 60s, you had the Wilson government. He refused to join the Americans and the Australians, it should be said, in the disaster that was the Vietnam War. But that was the exception, right? It wasn't the rule. The rule is, historically, since the war, Labour and the Tories line up and do exactly what the Americans say. And I think actually the direction of travel in Europe, not for France necessarily, I think France still has that very strong Gaullist tradition. But the rule in Europe, I think, is towards that lapdog poodle politics. If you look at people like von der Leyen, if you look at Olaf Scholz, these aren't people. They're not individuals. They're not with big historic political senses of mission. Of course, that can go very badly wrong as well, right? Look at Putin. I'm sure he has that. I wish he didn't. But they're not people that want to set out their own stall in terms of foreign policy in a way that, some leaders historically have done. Schroeder, Merkel dissented from what the Americans wanted in Central and Eastern Europe and also Russia. You might say that was a bad thing, but they did. But I think the direction of travel actually is in quite a dangerous direction, where you see really European leaders just kowtowing and doing whatever the Americans say. The idea that von der Leyen will say anything different to Washington. Come on, who are we kidding?
We've got more from that appearance from Aaron in a second, so stay with us. But we should quickly say that our fundraiser is continuing. Novara Media is entirely funded by small donations coming from you, our audience, very much unlike GP News. We're looking to gain 5,000 new regular supporters, and we're about halfway there. So if you haven't already, then head to novaramedia.com/support. That link is in the description box below on YouTube. And if you have already set up a regular donation, thank you. You make this show possible. We are so appreciative. Let's go back to that discussion featuring Aaron and look at what he said next.
We have to start behaving independently of the United States because they don't face the downsides of the mistakes they make. So when Iraq is invaded in 2003, what does it do? It creates calamity across the region, creates refugees. The same with Afghanistan, the same with Libya. Where do those refugees go? They go to Europe. They don't go to the United States. When we go have a face-off with Putin, whose energy prices go up? It's not America's, it's Europe's. So this idea that we have to be in hoc with the Americans each and every time, no, because of geography, because of their energy resources, they don't have to face the downsides of the choices they make. We do. It's very easy to make these choices.
We don't allow fracking.
Well, it's very easy to make all these choices when you don't have to actually have to be subjected to any of the pitfalls. And time after time, Europe is facing those, and our leaders don't do anything about it. Finally, on this point of the Gazans, Israel could displace 2.5 million Gazans. Where are they going to go? Egypt. Egypt said privately, we will send them to Europe. America's not going to have to take them. We do. And yet our politicians don't act independently of US interests because we say Western interests. We mean American interests. And the people that have to pay for that are Europeans, and I include Britons in that. We don't talk about this, and I don't know why.
It's a very interesting argument. I've seen you make this a couple of times on Twitter. I think you might have written an article about it as well. And sometimes you do get some pushback. People say, it's good you're arguing in favour of the Gazans, but why are you doing it with a sort of anti-refugee framing? I mean, how would you respond to that criticism?
I think this is so stupid. It's not anti-refugee. It's saying they shouldn't be refugees in the first place. I think there are people that are displaced by war. That's always going to happen. The point is, let's try and keep that to a minimum. There are enough wars and enough suffering in the world for refugees. My father was a refugee. He was studying in this country. There's a revolution in Iran, the Iran-Iraq war. He stays in Britain. So I'm very sympathetic to refugees. My point is, Western foreign policy shouldn't be based upon making as many refugees as possible. That's not a progressive argument. It's crazy. And the thing in particular with regards to the United States, Michael, is this. America can make, and it's quite unique in this regard, America can make lots and lots of bad decisions. It can invade lots of places. It can bomb lots of places. It can do loads of dumb stuff. And it doesn't really affect America, right? You can get rid of Gaddafi. Okay, well, what happens in 2015? Libya becomes the launching pad for 1.5 million people to come into Europe. I think Europe should welcome refugees. I think it ideally should be done in a coordinated way, not in a country with Libya post-Gaddafi, which has open-air slave markets. Again, maybe I'm not being sufficiently left-wing, but that's my view. So America can do that. They can, invade Iraq. Oh no, it's gone wrong. Oh no, ISIS is created. Oh no, millions of refugees are not just going to Europe, by the way, elsewhere in West Asia. Oh no, we invaded Afghanistan. Millions of refugees go to Pakistan. Millions of refugees go to Iran. Oh dear. Okay, let's have a confrontation with Russia. Our energy prices are still cheap, but Europe's skyrocketing now. Oh, don't worry, we can sell energy to Europe. So America makes all these decisions, which don't necessarily benefit America in the long term, but certainly don't harm them. Europe goes hand in hand with them and then gets absolutely hammered for them. We're getting more expensive energy, massive food inflation. We're getting millions of people being displaced in our near abroad. And I think that's really underscored with the example of Gaza. You have, Michael, this is crazy to me. You have conservatives in this country cheering on Israel in maybe displacing 2.5 million Gazans. You have a private Egyptian source quoted in the Financial Times saying, well, if they come here, we're sending them to Europe, right? Which is quite a credible thing to say. Egypt's got 38% inflation, population of 110 million. I can see why they might, expedite the travel of some people to Europe. And you have European conservatives cheering this on. And presumably when hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees come to Europe, they say, how did this happen? It's like Afghan refugees coming to Europe after invading that country. How did this happen? Or Syrians, or Libyans, or Iranians, or Iraqis. How did this happen? And this is really crystallized with Douglas Murray, right? Because he's a neocon. Douglas Murray would love a war with Iran. He would love a war with Iran. Neocons loved the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. That was their thing. But I don't understand how you can want wars perpetually in West Asia, but then complain when refugees leave those countries and come towards Europe. It doesn't make any sense to me. So I think this is a really important argument, Michael, that Europe can no longer afford to be party to the bad decisions made by the United States, because frankly, it doesn't really impact what's happening to the US. It does for us here in Europe.